She was never the one who did not see it. That is the lie everyone believed, including her. The world called her naive, called her hopeful, called her someone who stayed too long and noticed too little. But something was happening underneath the surface that no one bothered to look at. While everyone assumed she was blind, she was building a silent archive. Every unanswered question, every subtle withdrawal, every version of him that contradicted the version before it, she was recording all of it. Not with anger, not with suspicion, with quiet, disciplined attention. This is the part of the story people skip, because it does not fit the narrative of the foolish woman who loved too hard. What if she was never foolish at all? What if she was the only person in the relationship who was actually paying attention? And what happens to a man built on avoidance when he finally understands that the person he thought he could quietly disappear from was never confused about who he was, not even once? Human beings have a strange habit of confusing silence with ignorance. When a person stops reacting, everyone assumes they have stopped noticing. This is one of the most dangerous misunderstandings in psychology, because silence is not the absence of thought. Silence is often the sound of a mind working at full capacity, sorting evidence, testing patterns, and refusing to give away its conclusions too early. The woman in this story understood something most people never learn until much later in life. She understood that reaction is a currency, and every time she spent it carelessly, she gave away information about herself that she could never take back. So she chose to hold her cards close, not because she lacked feeling, but because she respected her own mind enough to protect it from being read like an open book. Avoidant behavior is often described as a wall, but that description is too simple and too kind to the people who hide behind it. A wall implies structure, stability, something built with intention. What avoidance actually resembles is closer to a maze with no center, a series of corridors designed to exhaust anyone who tries to reach the middle. The tragedy is that the person creating the maze rarely understands why they built it. They believe they are protecting themselves from pain, when in reality they are protecting themselves from the terrifying possibility of being fully known. Being fully known means being fully seen, and being fully seen means there is no more room to perform, to control the narrative, or to retreat into ambiguity whenever intimacy becomes uncomfortable. Here is a truth that almost no one says out loud. Avoidants are not afraid of losing love. They are afraid of what happens to their identity once they receive it. For most of their life, the avoidant has built a self-image around independence, control, and emotional efficiency. Love threatens all three. Love asks for dependency in small doses, vulnerability without a script, and moments where control simply is not possible. So instead of confronting this internal contradiction, the avoidant does something far more subtle than pulling away. They begin distorting reality just enough to make distance feel like logic instead of fear. They tell themselves the timing is wrong, the person is too much, the relationship is moving too fast, when the real sentence hiding underneath all of it is far simpler. They are afraid of becoming someone they do not yet know how to be. Meanwhile, on the other side of this dynamic, something far more complex is happening inside the person who appears calm. Calmness is often mistaken for peace, but in psychology, calmness can also be the outer shell of intense internal analysis. The woman who watched, who noticed, who stayed steady while everything around her destabilized was not experiencing peace. She was experiencing controlled observation, a state where the nervous system remains regulated specifically so the mind can think clearly. This is one of the least understood forms of emotional intelligence. People assume emotional intelligence means expressing feelings openly at all times. But true emotional intelligence sometimes means the opposite. It means knowing precisely when expression will cost you clarity and choosing clarity instead. There is a psychological principle rarely discussed in relationship content, and it explains almost everything about why she was never confused, not even for a single day. The principle is this: people reveal their truth not through what they say, but through the consistency of their patterns over time. Words are cheap. Words can be rehearsed, adjusted, and delivered with perfect emotional timing. But patterns cannot lie the same way, because patterns require repetition, and repetition eventually exposes structure. She was not listening to what he said about himself. She was studying what his behavior repeated across weeks, across moods, across moments when he thought no one was paying close enough attention to notice the difference between his words and his actions. This is where most people misunderstand emotional pain in relationships involving avoidant partners. The pain is not usually caused by cruelty. It is caused by inconsistency disguised as personality. One day warmth, the next day distance, one day depth, the next day surface-level conversation that feels like talking to a stranger wearing a familiar face. Most people call this confusing. She did not call it confusing, she called it data. And data, unlike emotion, does not require forgiveness to be understood. It only requires enough patience to observe it without letting it destabilize your sense of self. Somewhere along the way, society developed a strange obsession with romanticizing confusion in love, as if not understanding someone is proof of how deeply you care. This is a psychological trap disguised as devotion. Confusion is not intimacy. Confusion is often the direct result of one person refusing to be transparent, while the other person absorbs the resulting uncertainty and mistakes their own patience for weakness. Real intimacy requires clarity, not mystery. Mystery may create attraction in the beginning, but mystery sustained too long becomes a mechanism of control, whether the avoidant intends it that way or not. It becomes necessary now to introduce a harder truth, one that challenges the comfortable narrative most people prefer to believe. Empaths are often praised for their sensitivity, their patience, and their emotional generosity, but rarely are they asked to examine their own blind spot. That blind spot is this. Sometimes what looks like patience is actually a subtle form of self-abandonment, where the desire to understand someone else becomes more important than the need to protect your own peace. She was strong enough to observe without panic, but strength without boundaries eventually becomes exhaustion disguised as loyalty. This is the part of her story that deserves attention just as much as his, because growth requires honesty in both directions, not just criticism aimed at the person who left. Somewhere inside every avoidant person exists a quiet, almost unbearable question they rarely say aloud, even to themselves. The question sounds simple, but its weight is enormous. What if I let someone fully in, and they still choose to stay? This question terrifies the avoidant more than rejection ever could, because rejection confirms what they already expect, while genuine acceptance forces them to rebuild an identity they spent years protecting through distance. Rejection is familiar, acceptance is foreign territory, and human beings, whether they admit it or not, often fear the unfamiliar more than the painful. Consider for a moment what happens inside a courtroom before a verdict is announced. The jury does not shout, does not panic, does not chase the defendant around the room demanding answers. The jury simply watches, listens, and waits until the pattern of evidence becomes undeniable. She operated the same way, though no one around her understood the discipline required to think like this while your heart is quietly breaking in the background. Most people confuse emotional restraint with emotional numbness, but these are two entirely different psychological states. Numbness means feeling nothing. Restraint means feeling everything and choosing with tremendous internal effort not to let that feeling dictate your next move before you have gathered enough truth to act with precision instead of desperation. A dangerous myth exists inside modern relationship culture, one that quietly damages people who are actually paying attention to reality. The myth says that if you truly love someone, you should not have to think so carefully. Love, according to this myth, should feel effortless, instinctive, free of analysis. This sounds beautiful, and it is almost entirely false. Love without discernment is not romantic, it is reckless. The most emotionally mature people are not the ones who stop thinking once affection enters the picture. They are the ones who think even more clearly because they understand that affection can distort judgment faster than almost anything else in human experience. She never stopped thinking. She simply stopped announcing her thoughts before they were ready to be spoken. There is a particular kind of pain that avoidant partners rarely acknowledge even to themselves, and it deserves to be named directly. It is the pain of watching someone remain calm in the face of your emotional unavailability and secretly wondering if that calmness means they never truly needed you at all. This creates a strange, almost paradoxical anxiety inside the avoidant mind. They pull away to test whether the connection is real, yet when the other person does not collapse in response to the distance, the avoidant sometimes interprets that steadiness as proof of indifference rather than proof of maturity. This is one of the cruelest ironies in psychology. The very stability that should reassure them is the exact quality their fear-based mind misreads as abandonment in advance. Human beings often assume that avoidance is a form of control, and in some ways it is, but control is rarely the deepest layer of the behavior. Beneath control lives something far more fragile, something closer to shame. Many avoidants carry an unspoken belief that their authentic self, if fully exposed, would eventually become too much, too intense, too complicated, or simply not enough to keep someone interested once the initial performance faded. So they manage the relationship the way a person manages a budget during financial uncertainty, releasing warmth in small, careful amounts, terrified that giving more than necessary will leave them emotionally bankrupt if the other person eventually walks away. This is not cruelty. This is scarcity thinking applied to intimacy, and scarcity thinking almost always originates from an old wound the person has never been taught how to examine. Something must be said here that most relationship content refuses to admit, because it disrupts the comfortable hero and villain framework that keeps audiences emotionally satisfied. She was not a passive victim absorbing his confusion with saint-like patience. She made a choice, repeatedly, to remain in observation mode instead of demanding clarity earlier than she did. That choice protected her from chaos, but it also delayed her own liberation. Growth requires acknowledging this uncomfortable truth. Watching someone with clear eyes is wisdom. Staying indefinitely inside a dynamic that requires constant interpretation, no matter how skillfully you interpret it, can quietly become its own form of self-neglect if it continues without an eventual boundary or decision point. Philosophers have long argued that identity is not discovered but constructed through action over time, and this concept applies directly to what unfolds between avoidants and the people who observe them closely. The avoidant believes distance protects an already fixed identity. The empath sometimes believes patience will eventually construct a version of the relationship that matches the potential they see. Both are mistaken in different ways. Identity is not static, and potential is not promise. A person's future behavior cannot be built entirely from the architecture of who they might become, no matter how clearly you can see the blueprint hidden beneath their unfinished actions. At some point in every avoidant story, a moment arrives that changes everything, though it rarely looks dramatic from the outside. The moment is not an argument, not a confrontation, not a tearful confession. It is silence. The specific kind of silence that happens when the person who used to wait, wonder, and quietly hope simply stops doing all three at once. This silence is different from the avoidant silence because it is not built from fear. It is built from clarity, and clarity, once fully formed inside a human mind, is one of the most difficult things in the world to reverse, no matter how much charm, apology, or emotional reappearance follows it afterward. This is precisely the moment many avoidants describe as confusing, painful, and completely unexpected, though in truth it was neither sudden nor unpredictable. It was the natural conclusion of patterns repeating themselves without correction over an extended period of time. Human beings often mistake the ending of patience for the beginning of coldness, when in reality it is simply the completion of a process that began quietly long before the final moment became visible. She did not become distant overnight. She became complete in her understanding, and completion, unlike confusion, does not require further explanation to feel resolved. Somewhere inside this psychological shift lies one of the most overlooked truths about human connection, one rarely spoken aloud in mainstream conversations about love. People do not actually fear being left. They fear being left by someone who understood them completely and chose peace over chaos anyway. This fear cuts deeper than ordinary heartbreak because it removes the comforting excuse of misunderstanding. The avoidant cannot say she never saw who he truly was. The avoidant cannot say she was blinded by hope or naivety. The only remaining truth, the one that lingers long after the relationship ends, is the uncomfortable realization that she saw everything clearly and still made a decision rooted in self-respect rather than resentment. Grief operates differently when the loss involves someone who was never fully present to begin with, and this distinction deserves far more attention than it typically receives. Traditional grief mourns a person who existed fully and then disappeared. This kind of grief mourns something stranger, a version of a person that never fully arrived in the first place. She was not only releasing him, she was releasing the imagined, completed version of him, the one she could see forming in fragments, the one who almost showed up during certain conversations before retreating again behind old defenses. Letting go of potential is far more disorienting than letting go of memory, because memory has already happened, while potential lives permanently in the unfinished, and the unfinished never stops quietly demanding closure. An old idea from Stoic philosophy becomes strangely relevant here, though it is rarely applied to modern relationships with this level of precision. The Stoics taught that suffering often comes not from events themselves, but from the stories human beings attach to those events. Her suffering did not come from his distance alone. It came from the story she almost allowed herself to believe, the one suggesting that if she simply understood him well enough, patiently enough, and clearly enough, understanding alone would eventually produce transformation. This belief is one of the most quietly destructive ideas in modern emotional culture because it confuses comprehension with responsibility. Understanding someone's wounds does not obligate you to wait indefinitely for them to heal those wounds inside a relationship with you. Consider the psychological function of hope inside prolonged uncertainty, because hope is rarely examined honestly in these situations. Hope is often treated as a virtue, something pure and encouraging, but hope without evidence can quietly transform into a coping mechanism designed to avoid confronting a harder truth. She had to eventually ask herself a question that most people avoid for as long as possible. Was she hoping because the pattern genuinely suggested change was coming, or was she hoping because acknowledging the absence of change felt more painful than continuing to wait? This single distinction separates emotional maturity from emotional avoidance, and ironically, it applies just as strongly to empaths as it does to avoidance, even though empaths rarely apply that same scrutiny to themselves. There is a specific kind of respect that develops only through distance, and almost no one discusses this openly because it sounds counterintuitive at first. Closeness sometimes distorts judgment. Proximity can create emotional noise loud enough to drown out patterns that would otherwise be obvious. Once she created space, not out of anger, but out of necessity, something unexpected happened inside her own mind. She began to see the relationship with the same clarity a person gains when stepping back from a painting they had been examining too closely to notice its full composition. Distance did not create new information. Distance simply removed the emotional interference that had been quietly distorting information she already possessed. Meanwhile, the avoidant experiences a psychological event that traditional relationship advice almost never explains correctly. When someone stops chasing, stops explaining, stops trying to translate their own needs into language simple enough for an emotionally guarded person to finally understand, the avoidant does not feel relief immediately. They feel a strange, disorienting vacancy, similar to what a person feels when a constant background noise suddenly disappears. For months, perhaps years, they had unconsciously relied on her presence as an emotional anchor, even while pushing that same presence away. The absence of her attention does not simply feel like freedom, it feels like standing inside a room they used to control, only to realize the room no longer echoes back the way it once did. Human beings often assume that avoidants feel nothing when someone finally withdraws attention, but this assumption misunderstands the architecture of avoidant psychology entirely. Numbness was never the accurate description. Delayed processing is far closer to the truth. Avoidants frequently experience emotional impact on a significant time delay, sometimes weeks or months after an event has already concluded in the mind of the other person. This delay creates one of the cruelest ironies inside these dynamics. By the time the avoidant finally processes what was lost, the person they lost has often already moved through their own grief, rebuilt their boundaries, and constructed an entirely new relationship with their own sense of self-worth. At this point, a deeper psychological truth becomes impossible to ignore, one that challenges nearly everything popular culture teaches about closure. Closure is not something one person gives another. Closure is a decision made internally, often without any external confirmation at all. She did not receive an explanation that satisfied every unanswered question. She did not receive an apology structured perfectly enough to repair every inconsistency she had quietly documented over time. What she received instead was something far more powerful, though considerably less dramatic. She received her own permission to stop waiting for meaning to arrive from outside herself and began constructing that meaning internally instead. This shift represents one of the most significant transformations available to any human being navigating emotional pain, and it deserves to be named clearly rather than left as an abstract concept. The transformation moves a person from external validation toward internal authority. Before this shift, her sense of being understood depended heavily on whether he eventually recognized what she already knew about him. After this shift, her sense of self no longer required his recognition at all. This is not indifference. This is psychological sovereignty, a state where a person's internal truth no longer requires external confirmation in order to feel completely valid and fully real. Somewhere in the quiet aftermath of this transformation, a realization begins to surface that most people spend years, sometimes decades, avoiding entirely. Being right about someone's character does not always feel like victory. Sometimes it feels heavier than being wrong ever could, because being wrong leaves room for hope, while being right removes that room permanently. She was right about him from the beginning, and that accuracy did not protect her from pain. It simply changed the nature of that pain, transforming it from confusion into something closer to mourning the loss of a possibility she had never been foolish enough to fully believe in, yet compassionate enough to give a fair chance anyway. Here is what must be said plainly, without softening it for comfort. Being underestimated is not a wound. It is a mirror, showing you exactly who never took the time to look closely enough to see your depth. Stop mourning the person who mistook your silence for simplicity. That silence was never confusion. It was discipline. It was you, quietly gathering truth while everyone else demanded performance. Today, do one thing. Stop explaining your worth to people who only understood you once you were gone. Write down one pattern you ignored because hope felt safer than clarity, and decide right now that clarity will lead you from this point forward. You were never naive. You were paying attention the entire time. And attention, when disciplined enough, eventually becomes wisdom that no one can ever again mistake for weakness. Remember this: the ones who finally see you clearly are not always the ones who deserve to stay.